Hi, I'm Megan, a bookseller at Literati Bookstore and the host for tonight's event. This evening, we're pleased to welcome Cynthia Barnett to our At Home with Literati series in support of The Sound of the Sea, Seashells, and the Fate of the Ocean. She will be in conversation with Jennifer Skene. For our attendees, the chat is closed, but I'll be dropping links to purchase The Sound of the Sea Literati throughout the event. You can also use the Q&A feature in your toolbar to submit questions at any time. A reminder that you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup and shipping to your home anywhere in the United States, and that we're also open for in-person shopping. And now allow me to introduce tonight's author and moderator. Cynthia Barnett is the author of 3 previous books, including Rain, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and named a finalist for the Penn/E.O. Wilson Award for Literary Science Writing. She lives with her family in Gainesville, Florida, where she is also environmental journalist and resident at the University of Florida. Jennifer Skene is the Natural Climate Solutions Policy Manager with the NRDC's Canada Project and a clinical lecturer in law at the Environmental Protection Clinic at Yale. Her work focuses on policy advocacy around primary forest protection in the Canadian boreal and other northern forests, forest carbon accounting and regulation, and Indigenous rights. Jennifer co-hosts the Yale University podcast When We Talk About Animals, through which she explores with guests the astonishing non-human world and the reflections, lessons, and insights provides on our own humanity. She received a JD from Yale Law School in 2014 and holds a BS in Communication from Northwestern University. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Cynthia and Jennifer.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for hosting us, Megan and Literati Bookstore in wonderful Ann Arbor. And Jen, thank you so much for being in conversation with me tonight about The Sound of the Sea.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm so delighted to get to talk with you about this really tremendous book. And thank you to everybody who's joining the webinar. I think we're going to have a really terrific hour, really delving into this absolutely illuminating, captivating book, The Sound of the Sea, Seashells and the Fate of the Oceans. Just to set the stage a little bit, as Cynthia writes very early on in the book, we walk on a world of shell, which is just something that it's a mind-blowing sentiment, but it's absolutely true. And she goes through how intertwined humanity has been with shells throughout our history. And what follows from that is a really beautiful, astounding illustration of how not only is that true physically, but how shells are inextricably tied to who we are as humans and have been throughout human history. And this book really has some really astonishing, remarkable stories about indigenous societies, trade networks, and stories that also reflect the darker side of humanity, from slaves tasked with the grueling process of processing murex for their elite purple dye and the cowries behind the North Atlantic slave trade. But throughout is really a delightful, astonishing medley of science, anthropology, biography, policy writing, and journalism that really is a seamless blend of these genres that reflects the all-pervasiveness of shells themselves. And Cynthia, one question I have that just immediately pops out is, one aspect of this book that's so striking is just how vast it is. It literally spans 100,000 years. You open with the scene of that Neanderthal girl collecting shells on a beach and ending with a look into what shells mean for our future. And it's global as well. Did you always intend the book to be this sweeping? And how do you go about approaching and organizing a project like that?
It's a really good question. And Jen, thank you again for being here and for your appreciation for the book. And I should say, Jen interviewed me for the wonderful Yale podcast When We Talk About Animals. And I love that she read the book as deeply as she did. And I think that segment is still coming out in the future, right?
It should be out for first or second week of September.
Okay, sounds good. So I hope we get to talk a little bit more about your podcast too. But to answer your question about whether I knew how big it would be, when I started, I actually did propose when I wrote the book proposal, I did suggest that I would travel to the Maldives to kind of follow that story of the money cowries from the Maldives. And the money cowries, for the audience, money cowries were the first global money they served as money longer than any other coin or paper in human history. They were money traded globally for about 1,000 years. So the first global currency was not crypto, but cowrie. And I did write in the proposal that I plan to travel to the Maldives and follow the cowrie to West Africa, where cowries ended up purchasing up to a third of the enslaved people forced to the Americas. So I knew I would tell that story. What I didn't realize was the extent to which those issues of human justice would keep coming up. And of course, I proposed the book long before the Black Lives Matter movement. But being there and taking that trip during that time made it that much more poignant and powerful and important, I think. And so in that story and so many more, what comes out by the end, I set out to write a book about what shells had to say about the fate of the oceans, but I think they ended up having as much or more to say about people and how we treat each other. So we're sort of starting at the conclusion, but I think that's okay. The book ends up, talking about that reality that we really won't solve our environmental problems until we solve some of our deepest human problems and injustices. So I did have the idea that it should be global and that it should tackle the most profound human elements, but I think I didn't realize just what that meant or how long it would take. I thought this book would take me a few years, as each of my other books did, and instead it took me 6 years. So it really has been my most intense book, I think, in terms of the reporting and the writing.
Which is, you're certainly no stranger to big topics. You have the book Rain, which also you would think of as a very, very sweeping, glimpse at that phenomenon. But yeah, this one it's just absolutely mind blowing in its vastness. And you also do such a wonderful job of bringing it down to the level of humans and societies and the animals also behind these really incredible works of art, for lack of a better word. One thing that might be sort of the elephant, or I should say the giant clam in the room, is that not a lot of people actually know what shells are. You mentioned a survey of guests at the Shell Museum, and 90% of them didn't realize that shells actually came from animals. They thought they were some sort of rock.
Yes.
But the story is so much cooler than that, as you describe in depth in your book. Where do shells come from? Can you talk a little bit about that, and why we have this disconnect from them?
Sure, and I love the metaphor that you just used. I'm going to have to start saying the giant clam in the room instead of the elephant in the room. And by the way, everyone, I have worn my favorite elephant blouse from India for Jen tonight, because Jen's podcast called Why We Talk About Animals, when we talk about animals, has an elephant icon. It's really lovely. And I want to recommend the podcast to everyone. But essentially, yes. And that's actually how I got the idea for the book. I wanted to write about the oceans because I had written previously about freshwater and of course rain. And I wanted to turn next to the oceans as a sort of completion of the hydrologic cycle. And I was not intending to write about seashells, but I was at this lovely seashell museum called the Bailey Matthews National Shell Museum on Sanibel Island in Florida. And I was having dinner with the director and learned that a survey they had done found that 90% of their visitors, and most of these people are tourists visiting Florida with their children, most of those people didn't know that a shell was made by a living animal. And that really got me thinking and really disturbed me. And I think by the time I fell asleep the night I heard that, I had decided to write this book. The seashells are made by marine mollusks that use biomineralization. That is, they take in minerals from the surrounding seawater to build their shells. So mostly out of calcium carbonate, and they build their shells according to a blueprint that might take, well over 50,000 different forms, depending on the species. And they evolved these beautiful seashells essentially for protection, to protect themselves from their enemies. So when you see those beautiful spikes and spires and spines and sometimes really narrow little apertures or trapdoors that slam shut when you pick them up, sometimes these are all elements of defense. So our beauty is their protection, and there's something really, really nice about that, I think.
One other thing that is so striking is we all seem to have this common relationship to shells. No matter whether you're, calling in from Michigan or from Florida or from California, we all sort of have these childhoods that in many ways are wrapped up in shell collecting, and it's, been a part of our own childhoods. Was this something that was part of yours, and how did you come to, be so drawn to this topic?
Yes, that's a great question. I did love seashells as a child. I am from Florida. I spent a lot of time on the beaches of Florida and California as a child. I always, picked up shells with my grandmothers and with my mother, and they were always important in our family. But I was never a rabid shell collector. And I really came to know that once I started working on this book, and I understood the depth of, it's like sheer madness how people grow to love seashells and collect them and become obsessed about them. One of the collectors in the book had collected more than 1 million seashells in his lifetime. He lives here in Florida. So something that struck me about seashells was that touchstone. And that's really an important reason behind this book. It struck me that seashells could be really good ambassadors for the oceans, because so many people love seashells. And even if you don't collect them, they just draw us with their beauty. And there's something fundamentally aesthetic about them that has to do with their patterns and their flourishes and their colors and their textures. And I think we feel that from childhood, but we also perhaps fundamentally feel that human memory from earlier times, because we have collected seashells from practically the time human beings could walk standing upright and walk along a beach. We have collected shells. And you already mentioned that I opened the book with a Neanderthal girl, thinking about a Neanderthal girl walking the beach in Spain and picking up seashells. And archaeologists know that they did so from the stashes of seashells that they found in Neanderthal caves that were obviously picked up empty and not for food. And so I love that idea. As you said, you think about stashes of seashells in Neanderthal caves, or in some grandmother's house in Michigan, or in the seashell lamps that my mom made in the 1970s. Seashells are everywhere. They're everywhere in nature and underfoot, but they're also a part of our lives that hangs around. Literally, after I finished the book, I got a package in the mail from my mother, and it was a bag full of seashells that I had collected with my grandmother. And who knows how long they had been in my mom's basement or attic or wherever they were. And she had saved them all that time, and she still had the little shell collecting guide that I used with my grandmother to identify shells. So that was, they were clearly an important part of my life, even though I wasn't a collector. And boy, the collectors are really, really a whole nother story.
Yeah, they really are. And you have a lot of really fascinating characters and episodes throughout the book that show just how gripped people are by shells and shell collecting. You mentioned how in the Netherlands at the same time as this tulip frenzy, you also had this shell frenzy. And the same thing also happened here in the United States as well, right after the war. There was this really surge in interest around shells and shell collecting in a way that was actually rather damaging to the shells themselves.
Yeah. So an interesting part about the American shell craze that happened in the mid-century is its relationship to World War II. So there were all these servicemen, all these young men were serving in the Pacific in these gorgeous places with these tropical shells, and they were undergoing a hellish time. And I just imagine some of these soldiers being in the war and seeing something beautiful and bringing it back for a girlfriend or their wives, or putting it in their pocket. So a lot of GIs brought home seashells from places like Hawaii and Palau and other parts of the Pacific. And there was a direct connection between those young soldiers coming home and the seashell craze that rises after World War II in the United States.
How did you think about, how, once you sort of landed on this really expansive topic, how you went about organizing the book? Because the way you do it is really, it seems very, very obvious, but it's not. The way you organize it according to different shell types, and then you have these beautiful sketches of the shells themselves at the start of each chapter. How did you decide to take that approach?
That was a difficult decision because, as I mentioned, there are more than 50,000 marine mollusks known, and perhaps double that unknown and unidentified. And it was pretty overwhelming to try to figure out how to tell this story of marine mollusks and humanity in one book, right? And so and in the beginning, I thought too that I would be writing more about shellfish, the marine mollusks that we eat, like oysters and clams and so on. So I did a lot of work on oysters, a lot of work on clams. And in the end, I found myself really having to narrow it down. It was too large of a subject. And so I decided to choose 12 iconic shells, the 12 shells that were really iconic in human history that could also tell an important story. And so I ended up choosing these 12 shells that are at the base of the book, which include the money cowrie that we talked about, the lightning whelk, which is this shell I quickly held up, which is a beautiful seashell, well known to Floridians. It is a shell that you find in the southeastern United States, and you find them a lot on both coasts of Florida. The chambered nautilus is another one, the giant clam, the queen conch. So I chose these shells that people might feel close to and might recognize. That means I left out the oysters and most of the clams, although I used the giant clams for a chapter. And in the end, I decided that there have been other books written entirely about oysters, like Rowan Jacobson has written a lovely book about oysters. A friend of mine named David Berger wrote an entire book all about razor clams, and that is a beautiful book. And so I decided to concentrate on seashells writ large and iconic seashells. And I do write about marine mollusks that we eat, including bay scallops and queen conchs, and of course, the giant clams are also eaten. The lightning whelks that I just showed you, people eat those, but they weren't the traditional shellfish that we think of eating. So I decided to divide the book into those 12 shells. It has 13 chapters because I also devote a chapter to what came first. I look at the marine microfossils that existed before shells, because when I set out to try and explain shell makers, I kept thinking, or I kept saying to myself, yes, but what came before that? So I went, I was starting 500 million years ago with the evolution of mollusks. And then I kept thinking, yeah, but what made the very first shell? And so that kind of had me going back. So I actually start with biomineralization itself and the first tiniest organisms that made shell. And they too were making their tiny little shells to protect themselves from predators. So that's how the book is organized. And it's also chronological, which the reader may not notice that it's chronological, but for my mental health, I had to start way back at the beginning with the animals, the creatures that made those first shells, and then I kind of bring it through time. And so you learn about the evolution of these animals. And then in human history, it begins with those earlier indigenous people, and then goes through the Dutch shell madness, as you mentioned, and then sort of the American story through to the modern times.
One of my favorite chapters, you just mentioned the queen conchs. It was a really heart-wrenching chapter in many ways about these queen conchs and their decimation along the Florida coast. And these animals, which are themselves really incredible animals, which is, as Rachel Carson described as alert and sentient creatures, have been so central to lore and culture in South Florida. And people in the Keys are actually dubbed conchs because of that connection. But their populations have been plummeting in recent decades, and decades of really heroic recovery efforts, including a fishing ban and decades of research, have really been somewhat unsuccessful in restoring the queen conch's abundance. Can you tell us a little bit about what caused that decline? And I would also just love to have you read a little bit from that chapter in just a moment.
Sure. So one interesting thing to me about the queen conch's decline, as a Floridian, I have always known about the pressures on queen conchs, and I've always assumed that it kind of goes back to this and so much of what's wrong with the earth goes back to this intense rise of consumerism and consumption, which I think of as starting in the 1950s, but it's really so much older than that. And the queen conch is a good example of this. The demise of queen conchs and so many other animals begins in the era of colonialism. So peoples in Florida and the Caribbean, the islands of the Caribbean, so all the way from South America across the Caribbean islands and up to Florida, queen conchs flourished, and the indigenous peoples of those islands lived with and on queen conchs. They've been really important to their diets, to tools, and during the colonialist times, I'll start with the Queen Victoria's era. Queen Victoria herself loved this beautiful pink shell that came from the empire. The empire of the British Caribbean, and she had her brooches made from this shell. She had commemorative cameos made from this shell, and there was another shell madness in Victorian times, and there were just tons of queen conchs shipped to England. And so that to me was a really interesting story, because I found some very early scientific worry from the 19th century. For example, the Bahamas fisheries commissioner, the British fisheries commissioner to the Bahamas had written a report that said he really thought that there should be a limit on conch fishing in the Bahamas in the 19th century. And it couldn't be done politically, and it wasn't done. But you can really see the worry starting that early. And in the case of Florida too, you mentioned Rachel Carson had written about the queen conchs, and she was very worried about queen conchs in the 1950s. But even in the 1930s, fisheries scientists in Florida were saying, this population could be overfished. These are really big for any listeners or viewers who don't know a queen conch. It's a large, beautiful seashell, bright pink, and it can weigh like 5 pounds. It is really large, and the animal inside is sort of a lumbering animal. They do their somersaults, but they move very slowly, and they're very easy to collect. So they herd in the seagrass, and they're easy to collect, and collect them we did in Florida and throughout the Caribbean. And like I said, by the early 20th century, they were already imperiled. By 1980, the population had collapsed, and only then did Florida ban conch fishing. And Florida wildlife managers said at that time, we're going to ban it temporarily because they'll come back. We'll ban the conch fishing and they'll come back. And that has been more than 4 decades ago, and they've never come back. So Florida, as you said, Jen, people in the Keys are called conchs. The Key West is called the Conch Republic. This is the nickname. When you go to the Keys, you eat conch chowder and conch fritters, and you buy beautiful pink shining conch shells in all the tourist shops, but none of that conch comes from Florida. It all comes from the Bahamas, and the Bahamas conchs are imperiled too. Now it's like so many other things. Our problem has shifted to the Bahamas because now all the conch we eat in the United States is harvested in the Bahamas, which sounds like it could stop pretty soon, because the people in the Bahamas are very concerned about their population. So it was a long time in coming. These issues didn't just start a few decades ago. And another theme in the book is how much of these pressures begin in the colonial era.
Yeah, I do really want to get to this idea of humanity and consumption, and what our consumption of shells is really said about, our own values and priorities, and especially as it is reflected in colonialism and imperialism. But I'm wondering first, if you wouldn't mind reading from that Queen Conch chapter, the bit about the animals themselves.
Yeah, so I worked very hard to animate these animals. So like we were saying at the beginning, so many people are in love with seashells, but they don't realize that there are these, or even if they do realize there are animals inside, they might see them as kind of slimy or not that interesting. And they're actually incredible animals that hop and swim. And as I said, even the queen conchs seem to do somersaults sometimes as they hop away from their predators. So in each chapter, I really try to give life to the animals that build the shell, as well as writing about the wonder of the shells themselves and the wonder that people have for shells. And so I'll read you a little part about the queens that talks about them as their beings. And here I'm going to talk about the metamorphosis of a queen conch. So here's the other wonderful thing, and I have to mention, I really want to credit the scientist who has helped me understand the metamorphosis of queen conchs. Her name is Dr. Megan Davis, and she's actually an aquaculture expert at Florida Atlantic University. I was recently with her in Puerto Rico because she is building a queen conch hatchery in Puerto Rico. It'll be the first hatchery in the Caribbean that is run entirely by fishers themselves. And that is a beautiful story. And her dream is to build such hatcheries on every island in the Caribbean. And it's not going to solve the overfishing problem because that will require regulation. It will require us living differently with these animals, but it is a nice piece of the solution that a hatchery can be a place where queen conchs are grown from these tiny larvae into the grand animals they become. So this little section follows a part where I talk about the queen conch mother laying her eggs. And this is another beautiful thing. As I mentioned, queen conchs herd on the seagrass. They're male and female. The male conch has a spade-like looking penis, and it swerves it over to the female queen conch. It fertilizes the eggs, and the queen conch lays this incredible string of eggs. This string would stretch as long as a basketball court if stretched out end to end. But when she lays the eggs, she kind of camouflages this string in sand, and she heaps it up in a little pile so that it would look like a little piece of coral to a passing sea turtle or another predator. So this follows that explanation. And now I'm talking about the larvae. The larvae's metamorphosis is every bit as royal as that from chrysalis to monarch. Inside the hideaway their mother has made, larval conchs start right away on the shell, which begins as a delicate gossamer bubble. Within days, the soft shelled embryos begin to spin inside their eggs as if practicing the somersaults to come. The spinning signals that they are ready to hatch and drift into the water as veligers, small as this period. The weeks ahead mark the only time in its life a queen conch swims freely, floating for many miles on the ocean currents. The atom-shaped veliger sprouts petal-like lobes, first 2, then 4, then 6. By the time it's 3 weeks old, the diaphanous shell is a perfect spiral, and the 6 lobes have stretched out to limbs that brace its landing on the sea bottom and set it crawling on the grass. It crawls, then swims again, then crawls, then swims, looking for just the right spot to settle. Its freewheeling infancy comes to an end as the conch resorbs its wiggling limb fins. It grows the clawed foot and its other molluscan features, its snout-like proboscis to eat, gills to breathe, now complete with a perfect tiny shell that can sit on the tip of your finger. The juvenile queen conch buries itself in the sand for the first year of life, invisible but for its little periscope eyes. For that year and about the next 4, young conchs devote their energy to evading predators, marine worms and small crabs, then larger stingrays, lobsters, octopus, and sharks. By the time they are about 5, they've bulked their palace into a fortress so secure that most of their natural predators no longer try to break in. There is only one menace left to worry about.
I just love the way that you describe the animals throughout the book, and they really become very much their own characters and are, remain the stars of the book, even though you have such a vast array of incredible people that you profile, including Megan Davis and other really amazing scientists who have been instrumental in documenting and collecting shells and these animals. When you first started this, you sort of hint in the book about how your own relationship to the shells has sort of, and to the animals has sort of evolved over the 6 years that it took you to write the book. And you have at one point, you going out on your boat and harvesting scallops. And it seems from your book that perspective on the animals themselves sort of, and the values behind them sort of changed for you. Can you talk a little bit about what that shift was?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for saying that. Thank you for appreciating the life that I give the mollusks, because I worked so hard on that in each chapter. And I'm really glad that their lives come through, because for some of these animals, it was easier than with others. The queen conch is so amazing that it all in the end, they were so worth that treatment, but sometimes their life cycles were really complicated and it was hard to make them lyrical and boil it all down. So I'm glad that worked for you. My own relationship with marine mollusks and seashells and shellfish changed over the writing of this book. And one story I didn't tell in this book, although I've told it in another book, there's an anthology in Florida called The Wilder Heart of Florida that is an anthology of nature writing published earlier this year by the University Press of Florida. I have an essay in that collection where I talk about my childhood with my father, fishing for all kinds of conchs and learning to spearfish and eating conchs with my father. He would collect all different kinds and make conch chowder. And when I look back at that, I think that, I think about the over collection and the fact that we collected more conchs than we needed. Like sometimes I collected them because they were so beautiful and I wasn't necessarily thinking of them as animals. And as you say, Jen, in the bay scallop chapter, I also write about hunting bay scallops with my children in the Gulf of Mexico. So that was an important part of their upbringing. We always raised them around the sea and we had a small skiff, and every year from the time they were very little kids, from the time they could swim, we would take them out in the Gulf of Mexico with our snorkeling gear and snorkel for scallops, which is a big thing in the Big Bend area of Florida. And that was a beautiful part of their childhood. And I never thought a lot about bay scallops themselves and the condition of bay scallops. And when I started working on this book, over the years, the more I learned about bay scallops, the less interested I was in going out and pursuing them, or certainly in eating them. So by the time I finished, and remember this was 6 years, so the kids were young teenagers when I started, and they were older teenagers when I finished. By the time I finished that chapter, we were still going out into the Gulf of Mexico and enjoying the season, which is in the summer, and enjoying the beautiful seagrass meadows but we weren't collecting scallops anymore. We were just enjoying being out in the Gulf of Mexico. And me personally, I was enjoying taking underwater pictures by then. And I was seeing a lot more wildlife too. And so I have not eaten a wild bay scallop in several years. I haven't eaten queen conch in several years since learning as much as I did about queen conch or giant clam. My personal ethic for eating shellfish has changed. I still really enjoy shellfish, and I still eat something like a cedar key clam, which is a very special small clam that is grown via aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's a delicious clam, and it's a quite sustainable industry because it keeps the clamming, gives the community incentive to really keep the water clean. This community tends to turn down any proposals that would harm water in the Big Bend area because they care so much about their clam fishery. And there are other sustainable shellfish fisheries all over the world. In fact, there's probably a more sustainable form of aquaculture than fish aquaculture or shrimp, because the shellfish don't require to be fed. They're filter feeders that are keeping the water clean. So my approach to this was with a lot of humility. I think so often environmental rhetoric or writing, or perhaps even the kind of work you do, Jen, in advocacy, it can be a little too strident, and I think it can turn people off and make them shut down and not really hear what is being said. And I think my approach was to just be very honest about my own process and to kind of bring the reader along with me when I was learning about shellfish and kind of changing my personal ethics. And I think that is what is happening on the large scale across the globe. And these are ethical changes that we've been through before, right? In the early 20th century, in the United States, we stopped hunting plume birds. Mid 20th century, we finally stopped pouring industrial pollution and sewage directly into our waterways. We do change over time. And I wanted to show that change without being too preachy. And so I hope that works. I wanted to show the reader that, this is we're humans. And so this is going to be an imperfect process, but it's a matter of learning together and caring for the earth and its life in more sensitive ways as we figure out how to be on this planet with 8 billion fellow people and how to care for animals in that situation.
Yeah, I really appreciated the way that you did that and how you brought it really down to also the level of the individual through your own experiences, because, throughout the book, you're talking about, societies very generally and sort of broad trends and broad, fanaticism around shells and broad consumption patterns, and getting to just, see this through your own story and your own tale of grappling with how you view animals and how you view consumption was really, really effective.
Thank you. And I want to turn the tables on you a bit, Jen, and ask you a similar question, because, I'm a huge fan of the podcast when we talk about animals, and I'm really excited that you interviewed me for the podcast. And I wanted to ask you how the podcast came about, and also personally, is your hosting the podcast changing your relationship with animals in the sort of way that I went through, or were you sort of already there before you got involved with the podcast?
Yeah, well, I have to give a shout out to my co-host, Rebecca Morris, who is just an incredible scholar and thinker around animal rights more generally and around animal advocacy.
Yes.
She's with the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale. And she's actually the one who started the podcast a couple of years ago, along with Lindsay Notzel, who was her co-host at the time. And I was a bit of an interloper who came in about a year and a half ago and was fortunate enough to get to join Viveka. We call it sort of this big elaborate scheme to just get to talk to really interesting people like yourself. And so I can't really speak for how it came about for her, but in terms of my own work, a lot of what I do, working sort of with forest protection, Indigenous rights issues broadly, doesn't really come, it's more at sort of a landscape level and an ecosystem level.
Right.
And there's sort of a bit of a divide in the environmental movement between animal rights advocates and environmentalism in its more traditional sense. And this has really given me a peek into that other world, and it has been very transformative for me and how I think about it and just how I view our own sort of human interactions with the world and how I view ecosystem dynamics and at the big level, but also at the level of individual species. And I'll say this is also true, not just with animals, but also thinking about, we've also been fortunate to sort of broaden the podcast a little bit to also talking about trees and fungi and thinking about, how we interact with and relate to those creatures and those beings. And it's definitely, made me recognize, I think, you mentioned the word humility a few minutes ago, and that's definitely the word that I would also apply to thinking about how we need to be reevaluating our own relationship to animals. And my sense is that there's really multiple levels that this can be applied to. One is this idea of human exceptionalism, that somehow we've risen above this primordial muck and the brutes in the world that makes us special. Because of course, with that mentality comes not only the notion that we have a right to take as much as we want from the world when we want it, but that we're actually untethered from the consequences of doing so, which, as your book so poignantly shows, is absolutely not the case, and that it is quite literally killing us to be doing that. The other sense of the word humility is that, if we're going to be saving our planet and our world as we know it, we need to start acknowledging how little we actually know about it and recapture not just the fear that comes from that, which has historically sort of driven us, but also the sense of wonder. Right before we talked to you, we talked to this incredible marine biologist named Edie Witter, who writes in her recent book that she has this quote on her desk that says, "The world will not perish for want of wonders, but for want of wonder." And I just love that quote because it really speaks to how we've lost the sense of any kind of imperative of needing to steward and protect the world, along with the drive to. And it gets to the survey that you mentioned in your book, where if 90% of people, think that shells are just inanimate rocks, there's really nothing to do but, put them on the mantle and enjoy them. But when you start diving into the life behind them and the fact that we've, explored a minuscule fraction of our oceans and know so little about tree and animal intelligence and communication, it just creates a whole new imperative and drive to protect these beings. And that's why, that's something I love so much about your book, is it opens up this whole other wonderful world that so few people are aware of, and exposes how much more we have to learn.
Yes. And the book you're talking about is about bioluminescence, right?
That's right. Yeah. So Edie Witter is an oceanographer, and she just came out with a really tremendous book called Below the Edge of Darkness over the summer. So highly recommend that one as well.
Yeah, and another one on the same topic is Dr. Helen Scales' new book on the deep oceans. And both of those books were reviewed in the New York Times a couple of days ago by Robert Moore, who is a terrific nature writer himself. And so, yeah, those are two more books to purchase at Literati. We will perhaps, Megan can put those in the chat as well, and the links. I loved that interview you did, and I loved the one about the hedgehogs before that. It's
Hugh Warwick, yeah.
Yeah, really fun interview about hedgehogs. I'm envious of your podcast role. I think it's just wonderful to be able to learn about all these wondrous animals. And of course, Rachel Carson talked about the importance of wonder. And Jen, I write about the earlier nature study movement at the turn to the 20th century that was very much quashed during the rise of, sort of the kind of the warlike science of World War I. We just lost so much of that ethos for wonder and teaching children about science through the lives of, conch larvae and baby birds and gardens and all of those things. We really lost a lot that we need to get back now. You said it all really well, and wonder is a good word.
Well, I certainly want to also open it up for Q&As from the attendees. If anybody does have any questions, please feel free to pop them into the Q&A panel. And but I'm also happy to keep asking questions myself. I've really enjoyed this because it sort of has allowed me to delve into some of the things I didn't get to talk to you about last time. So selfishly, this has been such a pleasure. One idea, sort of notion that is often found about the natural world these days in books about the environment that's really hard to avoid, but your book actually manages to somewhat avoid in a way that I actually somewhat appreciate, is this idea of the word hope. And your book obviously came out in the midst of heat domes and unprecedented flooding and wildfires and all these records that were being broken, after the ones that were already being broken as you were writing the book. Was it a conscious choice on your part not to talk about sort of hope for the future? You talk about the giant clams and sort of their capacity to serve as a solution, but you don't talk about hope broadly in your own view of, whether you have sort of hope for our future. Was that a conscious choice?
Yes, that was a conscious choice to not use a term that I think is overused, that can be pat, that can be fluffy and not meaningful enough. I just try, but I always try as a journalist to, tell the story instead of writing platitudes. So I don't think it's that the book lacks hope. I think it's there, but perhaps you're not reading the word or the broad statement. The more important thing that I wanted to do is, show you projects that are underway around the world, or human ingenuity and invention. So by the end of the book, I travel to Palau, and in the giant clam chapter, I write about actually a Yale scientist. I traveled with the Yale scientist Alison Sweeney, who studies bioluminescence, but also luminescence in animals, including giant squid and giant clam, and is exploring the potential for algal biofuel applications from giant clams. And so I write about a lot of innovations. I write about the human health innovations, from cone snails that are used in pharmaceutical research. And I write about, I try to paint a vision of what the future could look like. And this world, you know, mollusks are really the perfect upcyclers, right? They take the calcium carbonate from the surrounding environment and turn it into this incredibly beautiful part of the earth. And, you know, we too are getting to this place where we need to be able to reuse things and turn to biofuels and, you know, do more of what the mollusks do. So I try to explain that in concrete terms without making it a platitude. I guess that's the best answer I can give you. But yes, I did purposefully try to avoid writing too much about hope. I think you'll see the word in here sometimes. And I do write too about the next generation and kind of you know, the young people at the end who were I'm back in Sanibel Island with some of those young people who are really totally knowledgeable and interested in the live animals now instead of the shells. And that's another interesting piece, that there has been this incredible rise of citizen science that includes children. So I think you might be more likely today to see a child contribute to a citizen science project or to be involved in a beach cleanup, collecting plastic from the beach, than you would see them collecting a huge amount of seashells. And I think that is a fine and good thing.
Yeah, no, certainly the book left me with a lot of hope, even if it was not something that you addressed directly, which I actually very much appreciated, because to my mind, sort of, it doesn't ultimately matter. You just keep sort of fighting the fight no matter what.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so on that note, it looks like we've reached the top of the hour. Thank you for joining us, Cynthia and Jennifer, at Home with Literati. And thanks to your viewers as well. A reminder to buy The Sound of the Sea and listen to Jennifer's podcast when we talk about animals. Take care, everyone.
Oh, Megan, thank you so much for having us. And Jen, thank you so much for being with me in conversation. It's so much more fun to talk with you than it would be for me to give my slideshow. And so I really appreciate you being here. And thank you, Literati, for hosting us.
No, definitely my pleasure. Thank you, Cynthia, for chatting with me again, and thank you, Megan and Literati, for hosting us. It's been
and look out for the podcast when we talk about animals. Thanks.
Yeah, that'll be. You can hear more from Cynthia on that. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.